of our second. Thank you. The recording has begun, so I'll let everyone know we're recording this in order to have it up on the Center for Urban Youth Research website so that others may enjoy it afterwards, or people can return to it if folks here are interested in reviewing it again. Welcome everyone. I speak to you from the traditional territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples and the unceded and unsurrendered territories. In the settler colonial state, it's known as Ottawa, Canada. My name's Jackie Kinnelly. I recognize many names. It's wonderful to see familiar names and faces on our panel. I am the director of the Center for Urban Youth Research, which is a center that's located at Carleton University, which is in Ottawa. And I am basically here to welcome you to this second panel in our second series of virtual panels that the Center for Urban Youth Research has been putting on. As I mentioned, we're recording, and I also want to acknowledge, especially for anyone that's connected to Carleton, that we're actually on the first day of labor disruption, and we stand in solidarity with CUPE 4600, which is the TA and Contract Instructors Union, and we actually did check in with them in advance to say, hey, if you're on strike, we want to support you. How do you feel about a virtual event? And we're given the green light that a virtual event such as this, they didn't see as crossing the picket line inappropriately. But I do want to acknowledge that our colleagues are out on strike, and Shihan's a member of that union. And so I'll be joining the picket line probably tomorrow after my class, and we definitely stand in solidarity with them. And that's all I need to say. I think I want to acknowledge Shihan Erdal, who I'm pointing to my left. I don't know where he is on your screen, but Shihan is the coordinator of the Center for Urban Youth Research and is really the brain and the muscles behind pulling all this together. I am eternally grateful for Shihan's amazing organizational work, and many thanks, of course, to our moderator and panelists. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Stuart Poyntz, who's joining us from SFU, Musqueam territory. I'm going to let you do that land acknowledgement and let him take the floor and intro the panel.
Thanks, Jackie. It's wonderful to be with you all and to see some of your faces. It's still relatively early morning on the West Coast, but super beautiful today. So I'm very excited to be part of this session and to witness the conversation that's going to unfold. Some great participants have arrived and will present. As Jackie acknowledged, the land that she is situated on, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that SFU is on the traditional and unsurrendered territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, as well as the Coquitlam nations in Vancouver and Burnaby. And because our servers come to us from Surrey, I want to acknowledge as well that Katsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kakite, Musqueam, and numerous Stolo nations in Surrey that are the traditional and owners of these lands on which we are settlers. Our work at CIRI, which is where I come to you from, the Community Engaged Research Initiative at SFU, is deeply involved in Indigenous issues on a number of fronts and recognize the alliances and collaboration and work we do together as fundamental in understanding activism and social change today as we move to create a decolonized state that we can all live in together. As Jackie mentioned, we have a really rich panel. I have been part of a world of youth media studies and youth activism for a couple of decades, and the work that Jackie and the center are doing to bring attention and develop research and collaboration with youth activists in this area is tremendously powerful and so vitally needed today as we recognize the context of a emerging post-COVID world where young people's lives carry with them the burdens and the markings of a very difficult period that continues to situate their lives and their futures. And I think that will be part of our conversation today. The panel that is set up for us is examining the lives and sharing with us research on the lives of youth activists who are part of intersectional worlds of activism that cover a range of movements and activities and that address the lives of young people whose worlds are shaped by conditions of social class, education, race, sexuality, gender, age, and intergenerational inequalities that continue to shape the unjust conditions that are part of our societies here in the place called Canada and indeed around the world where people are with us, where people are joining us from. We have a fantastic panel of speakers, and I'm going to take a moment to offer the bios of speakers. Our process for this morning will be as follows. After introducing our speakers, I'm going to turn the floor over to begin with Janet Batsleer, who's going to get us started. Julia Sinclair-Palm will follow, and then Hava Gordon will conclude the presentations. We'll then follow up the presentations with a short discussion that I'll help to shape with questions to our panelists that try to bring together intersections across their presentations and discussions. Then we'll have a chance for audience members to share questions and observations. I'll ask you, and I'll remind folks of this, to keep your questions succinct so we have a chance to engage as many questions as possible and as rich an exchange as possible. And that'll bring us to the end of our conversation, which will be we'll have about 90 minutes or about 80 minutes now together. So with that introduction, and great thanks to Shihan and Jackie for bringing us all together in this series. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. And to begin with, let me share a little bit on Janet Batsleer, who's going to open up our conversation. Janet is Emeritus Reader at the Manchester Metropolitan University. She's worked for 30 years in the field of youth and community work, has contributed to the development of dialogue concerning feminist, anti-racist, and other critical approaches in this field. Professor Batsleer studied English at Cambridge and was a research student at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, many of us know as the origin point for cultural studies. She was there when Stuart Hall was director. She continued to work as a youth and community worker for 10 years before taking up a post as lecturer in youth and community work at Manchester Polytechnic in '86. We're really grateful for Janet's willingness to be with us today. I should say it's the end of her day in Manchester, and as in this instance, coming to us at a time when other preoccupations and concerns are preoccupying. Also with us this morning is Julia Sinclair-Palm from Carleton University. Julia goes by she, they pronouns and is an assistant professor in childhood and youth studies in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies at Carleton. They completed their doctorate in education in the Faculty of Ed at York University in Toronto. Research with young people carries the trace of this interdisciplinary history. Across their work, they consider how conceptualizations of children and youth are tied to concerns about violence, risk, and mental health, often at the exclusion of other more complex narratives of identity, gender, and belonging. And then finally, we have Hava Gordon with us. Hava comes to us from the University of Denver in Colorado this morning. Hava is professor of sociology who specializes in the social construction of inequalities such as gender, race, class, and age, social movements, schooling, and educational reform politics in the context of neoliberalism, also qualitative research methods. Her previous research work explored how multiple social inequalities shape youth political movements, and as the subject of her new book, We Fight to Win: Inequality and the Politics of Youth Activism with Rutgers. I apologize. Her latest published book is with NYU Press. It's called This Is Our School: Race, Resistance, and Community Struggles Over School Reform, which examines how local educational justice movements wrestle with neoliberal school reform and how youth activists navigate elites and other coalition partners in school reform struggles. We have a rich and a wonderful panel that will bring with us a sense of the lives of youth activists from across intersectional conditions. And to start us off in this conversation, wonderful to introduce Janet Batsleer from Manchester. Janet, take us away.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. Just to explain to friends and colleagues that I'm coping with quite a lot of pain right now. So although I'm not right at this minute because I've got a lot of painkillers, but I've agreed with the conveners that I will just speak briefly and to some headings rather than give a full paper. This work comes out of, what I want to say today comes out of the last 6 or 7 years of research, which began with a European project called Party Space. And one of the things we did in that project was to refuse to work from an existing definition of participation, but rather go to the range of young people's groups which we engaged with to discover how they were interpreting that term. And in doing that, we found ways of accounting for, at that time, participation, but I'd say now also this applies to activism, that sit alongside and belief and below perhaps more traditional forms of organising. Most young people who are part of groups that are not central, that are marginalised, that are in the urban peripheries, don't identify with the political, don't identify with participation. But Dr. Elizabeth Ackerley, in her recent doctorate at Manchester University, showed in her study, her ethnography of a working class social action project in the city, that the term activism was one that they did associate with and were able to associate with. So what I wanted to do briefly was to look at some of the practices in the creation of social spaces that are within those peripheral, those what de Souza calls those sacrificed states and populations, and to see how young people's creation of those social spaces engages with practices which move towards solidarity. In those spaces, it's the engagement with difference that comes to the fore as a way of resisting authoritarian populist ways of engaging with difference. And community becomes an active practice of making rather than a taken for granted essentialist form. And in making the account, I've returned to Audre Lorde. Too often we pour the energy needed for recognising and exploring difference into pretending those differences are insurmountable barriers or that they do not exist at all. This results in either voluntary isolation or treacherous and false connection. Either way, we do not develop tools for using human difference as a springboard for creative change. The young activists in the places and spaces that we engaged with and we remain engaged with are enabling that difference to become the springboard for creative change. There are a number of theoretical influences underlying this, and I won't spell them all out now, there isn't time. You'll hear Butler in there, I'm sure. You'll hear also, I hope, Shihan Erdal's work in his chapter in Young People, Democracy and Community Development, which we edited recently. And I want to come back to Chantal Mouffe at the end. Now, what we've done is to look at 3 practices that we've found existing across different spaces: practices of naming, protagonism, becoming creators. That's the first. Practices of sharing, and that's especially in relation to sensory practices. And we've thought about eating as a very, and food sharing is a very common practice. And then practice of listening, and wanted to say something about discomfort in that space. So naming, sharing, listening, and particularly issues of discomfort. In each of these practices where they're concerned with radical democracy, there's a refusal to deny difference. There's an engagement with difference, and that involves both an emergence of joy, but also an emergence of vulnerability. Practice of naming is critical, really, because it's only in refusing the names which have been allocated to the young people, for example, in a social space in North Manchester, generally regarded in the eyes of poverty porn as deprived, criminal, and poor. The continual refusal of those self-descriptions by the young people who organise in those spaces is central to their ability to organise the spaces. It's only by moving away from the abjection that they can begin to learn to spell, in Stuart Hall's terms, names that they knew they had before they claimed them. They knew that the names they were being given were wrong. Then the process of organising creates new names, new spaces. This is very familiar, of course, from queer, but it's important to name it in all these spaces of marginalisation. And especially in relation to poverty, where there is not a single, I don't think, there's not a single way of speaking about poverty that people who are named in that way won't reject. The second was practice of sharing, and we need to look at food in a similar way. What is it that can't be swallowed? What can't be swallowed in practices that we call it philanthropic soup. It's a way of insisting that you take my medicine when I share my food with you, a way of saying, if you eat this food with me, then you must learn to eat well, you must learn to eat properly, you must learn to fit in with the ways that we do things here. And there's a lot to say about practices of food and sharing, but other kinds of sensory experiences as well. Music comes to mind. The bit I'd like to just concentrate on, though, for the last little bit, though, is discomfort and the practices of listening. I'm just going to read a quote from a young person in Rainbow Playground, which is a queer space organised in Manchester. And this is a non-binary young person talking about their life. In terms of being X is a skeleton called X. The skeleton identifies as non-binary. No one will live with them. They're socially awkward and can't get a proper job because they're a skeleton. They're making money on the internet. The only job they can find is at Halloween being scary. They just want to do something else, but they're scared because being different, they're always treated differently. This kind of humorous self-account as part of organising a space for non-binary young people in Manchester is both brave and creative and touches on a universal condition. We are indeed all skeletons, and at the same time brings a certain sadness to the fore. And in talking about this, I want to say something about grief. grief in these practices of listening. Because in building solidarity and listening across difference, we're caught up in a practice that has been called witnessing, encountering the damage and harm inflicted in current systems at many kinds of borders, whether these lie in policing, in school exclusions, in encountering the effects of climate emergency. Deep listening involves engaging and so searching out actions that shift the border, shift the burden, and the tensions of social relations away from those who are usually expected to carry them. Listening to young people at the front line takes community makers as activists to challenging, painful, and difficult places. And it seems at moments to break into a challenge to bear the unbearable. The strength of witnessing and the ways in which it differs from spectating arise from who sets the terms of engagement, not the state, not the market. How the invitation from young activists to look differently and to listen from the other side of the street arises. And it's sometimes a question of where you stand or of where you find yourself standing when grief and harm occurs. And calling this activism seems to me to involve being there at key moments with others, and then turning to find what resources can be mobilized and what spaces opened up as a result of these meetings across difference. So these spaces that Sarah Ahmed calls fragile spaces are continually being opened up among and by young people living in the urban peripheries and in resistance to those vicious namings that they experience. 3 practices, naming, sharing, listening, are integral to the creation of radical democratic social space. Each in their way involves an encounter with harm. You can't escape that, and the possibility of witnessing. Such practices can create an effective space of courage, which then opens up the possibility of what some young activists refer to as healing-centered organising. Practice of naming, practice of sharing and hospitality, practice of listening, especially to discomfort, all become openings to the possibility of democratic change towards more equality, more freedom, and more solidarity and friendship. The theorist of radical democracy, Chantal Mouffe, has suggested that those who oppose the exclusionary, build the wall forms of authoritarian or technocratic populism must attend to and articulate alternative responses to the question of what makes us safe in the world. To answer the question about who gets to participate, who gets to call themselves or be recognised as an activist, is also to contribute to answering Mouffe's question about what kinds of effective relations can challenge the promise of security based on exclusion and building of walls. And of course, this gets to be linked to more formal political democracy in the work of making the new. But these spaces, these very informal, these non-recognised, these small spaces of attunement and listening and responsiveness, of witnessing, do make possible, partly through an estrangement of the self, I would argue, and there's not time to go into that in detail here, but they do make possible moments of joy, song, dance, and even prayer in the most desperate of circumstances. And these are patterns that we see over and over again in many of the faces of activism that we've engaged with. Thank you.
Janet, thank you so much. I'm not sure if we're supposed to clap, but I'd like to clap. And as Julia has done, putting clapping hands on the screen. What a wonderful opening to our panel, especially in the conditions you introduced us to at the beginning. Your focus on naming, sharing, and listening is just brilliant as a way of understanding the effective conditions of beginning that these spaces open up. So much to talk about. And now I'm very honored to turn the floor, as it were, the tile, as it were, over to Julia Sinclair-Palm from Carleton. Julia, thank you. Please take us away.
Hey folks, it's lovely to be here. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about queer and trans youth activism in the US and Canada, and I'm thinking about this difference between streets and in schools. And some of this work is like is a little bit old in that it's drawing on some of the research I did in my master's around some youth activism in San Francisco in the 60s, and then connecting it a little bit to some more recent thinking around youth activism. So it's bringing a couple things together. My talk is on a computer over here, so I'm gonna like look over here sometimes, but I will try to come back to you, but I'm letting you know that my look over here is, it's really just to attend to my talk. Okay, great. So queer and trans youth have always been leaders in social movements, but their access to and strategies and degrees of inclusion in social movements have changed throughout history in relation to their socio-political context, resources, ability, and technology. Formal and institutional queer and trans youth organizations are often adult-directed and created with the intention of supporting the proper development of queer and trans youth. And so youth are intrinsically conceptualized in many youth organizations as in need of guidance, protection, and support. So the history of queer and trans youth organizing is often left out of the story of lesbian and gay movements and social change. And the absence of this history in these stories denies current queer and trans youth activists other ways of thinking about what's possible. So in this talk, I'm interested in thinking about a couple of questions. What issues do queer and trans youth engage in organizing about? What are queer and trans youth strategies for addressing the issues they care about? What role do queer and trans youth have in youth organizing? And then, more specifically, how does activism within the institution differ from activism outside the institution? So within youth organizing, activism is often defined as action for social change, a mode of democratic engagement within the public sphere, struggles for social justice, the transformation of civil society, and acts that challenge the status quo and seek to reconfigure asymmetrical power relations. In contrast to youth involved in organizing in formal institutions, youth activists are often cast as troublemakers rather than good civic participants. Neoliberal conceptualizations of youth work to frame young people as either at risk or risky. Both of these characterizations invite the intervention of the adult. The at-risk youth need support in their development, whereas the risky young person demands surveillance and control. These tensions inform what Kennelly calls the ideal youth citizen, who is involved in consumer-driven community service projects and does not intend to subvert the status quo. So Connor and Rosen argue that the neoliberal state construction constrains youth by reconfiguring power relations and narrowing publicly acceptable roles for young people. These characterizations of youth activism and organizing are particularly directed at marginalized youth. In this talk, I'm interested in thinking about the difference between youth organizing and youth activism and how queer and trans youth are positioned within each of these. I provide a historical example of queer and trans youth activism to think about how strategies have shifted within queer and trans youth activism and the possible effects of these shifts. I argue that queer and trans youth activism is most successful when it is not single issue focused. Multi-issue activism allows queer and trans youth to expand their organizational efforts and strategizing techniques and to focus on the needs of their entire community. I believe that when queer and trans youth work in collaboration with other communities, their activism better supports the needs of marginalized queer and trans youth. I also explore the ways queer and trans youth activism compares to adult-led LGBT youth organizations, one of which I think is GSA's. So scholars often disregard youth in their discussion of queer activist history, despite the important role they played in lesbian and gay movement movements in the United States and in Canada. In the 1960s, adult homophile organizations became established and, quote, modeled themselves on interest group politics and hoped to improve life for homosexuals by educating the mainstream public, end quote. These apolitical organizations, including the Mattachine Society, Society for Individual Rights, the Lesbian Daughters of Bilitis, argued in their quest, quote, in their quest for legitimacy, that integration into a mainstream culture through quiet assimilation would garner greater legal and social rights for gay people. They advocated for equality under the law, self-acceptance, and group unity, but did not seek to participate in declarations of public identity. In contrast, one of the first queer and trans youth organizations, called Vanguard, fought for, quote, revolutionary change and advocacy for personal and social transformation. Vanguard addressed a multiplicity of social and economic injustices and inequalities. Their motto of cooperation, not compromise, addressed their frustration with the, quote, cowardly assimilationist strategies of the homophile organizations, and speaks to the way they challenged social norms about sexuality and celebrated gay identity and sexualities. Many adults wanted to compromise in order to change legal barriers, gain acceptance, and achieve freedom. On the slide here, you're seeing a quote from the president's page, which is in the first issue of one of the magazines that Vanguard published. And then you're also seeing some images they created. So the next slide is also the cover of one of their first magazine. So you're getting a little artwork. And these are taken from the, sourced from the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society in San Francisco. So if you're wondering where they're coming from. So Vanguard was intersectional in the LGBTQ activism and acknowledged the intersections between various social and economic inequalities. Gay liberation groups, including Vanguard, called for, quote, revolutionary change and advocacy for personal and social transformation, including a restructuring of entire cultural institutions. Vanguard, as the sole queer and trans youth organization in San Francisco at the time, vocalized the need for a public declaration and celebration of gay identity and sexualities, and proposed challenging straight and gay society's reproduction of constricting social norms. Through employing a distinct activist discourse apart from the homophile organizations, while simultaneously working alongside them, Vanguard cooperated with an established homophile community without compromising their militant discourse and activist strategies. Although many of the homophile organizations rigidly policed their members to ensure gender conformity, Vanguard called for a recognition and celebration of difference, of desire, gender, and sexual proclivities. They argue that by allowing difference within the queer community, more unity could be achieved. They believe that liberation would be achieved not through integration into various capitalist institutions, but through rejecting and overthrowing the institutions themselves. So one example of Vanguard's activist efforts was the Clean Sweep protest, where Vanguard members and allies literally swept the city oh my gosh, literally swept the city's streets, aimed to alert mainstream society to the presence and needs of marginalized gay youth that lived in the midst of the city center. By orchestrating a public act of protest and by alerting regional media to the activities, Vanguard established themselves as a radical community-based gay youth organization. Vanguard called for hustlers, drug addicts, and senior citizens to join in organizing around a multiplicity of social and economic injustices that affected all Tenderloin residents, not just Vanguard members. And so the street sweep was about cleaning up all the trash that rich white men who worked in businesses around the Tenderloin would just leave littered all over. And so it was about kind of recognizing the value of their community and coming together. So within Vanguard, their ideological diversity inherent to their organization may have produced internal conflicts when embracing a multi-issue approach, while retaining a membership with a single issue problem of gay identity. So for Vanguard, the former mobilized their organization, and the latter, eventually adopted by Vanguard, contributed to their demise. Although Vanguard fractured as they moved away from community-based justice, their successors utilized the single issue model as they carried the torch lit by gay liberation forwarded for a new generation of queer and trans youth activists. In the late 1970s, radical grassroots activism gave way to a more moderate tone, and the role of young people in the gay community changed from one where they were leaders in fringe movements to one where they became clients, quote, clients and participants in the community and school-based programs for gay youth. So between the mid-1970s and 80s, dozens of queer youth programs formed throughout the country with a focus on support, identity formation, social development, and risk reduction. Instead of a movement, quote, by youth and for youth, adult leaders formed these new groups on their own terms and invited young people to participate under adult mentorship. The movement shifted from youth-led multi-issue social justice activism to one where gay identity became the single cause. And that's where we get GSAs. So in many ways, the gay and lesbian movement in the 60s in the US and Canada led to the creation of GSAs in schools. In the mid-1970s, leaders in gay community shifted to become central in the development of community and school-based programs for queer youth. A number of queer youth programs formed throughout the US and Canada to address the discrimination and harassment queer youth were facing in schools, and many of these programs, including Gay Straight Alliances, also known as GSAs, were adult-led and provided youth with adult mentorship. Within this new structure, some queer youth organizing changed from being youth-led multi-issue social justice activism to a model of single-issue identity activism. GSA started in the late 1980s in a public school in the US, in California and Massachusetts, developing out of a few small projects seeking to address the bullying lesbian and gay students faced at school. Kevin Jennings is kind of the person credited with it, along with a few other teachers at Concord Academy in Massachusetts, formed the first GSA between 1987 and 1989. Jennings credited students for both the establishment of the club, as well as for setting the agenda of addressing homophobia, and for changes to the non-discrimination policy. Soon after the development of GSAs, Jennings also helped create something you've probably heard of, which is called GLSEN, right? The Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. And GLSEN remains invested in working to empower students to affect change by supporting student-led efforts to positively impact their own schools and local communities. That's a mandate from GLSEN. Curiously, Kevin Jennings fails to mention any account of gay youth activism in his book on gay history for young people, omitting the unique contributions of queer youth like Vanguard in his historical accounts. So GSAs have grown into a nationwide movement centered on making schools a safer place for queer students. Unlike groups like Vanguard, GSAs were formed to address the, quote, root cause of social and economic inequalities, but following Gay International's model, provide a safe arena for queer students within schools. GSAs are a safe space for youth to explore their sexuality and gender, find peers with shared identity, and provide support and opportunities to advocate for their peers. GSAs are also a place for youth to engage in activism around sexual orientation and gender diversity issues. GSAs are typically located within schools and are often referred to as clubs or extracurricular groups. These groups are grounded within youth program models that prioritize creating a safe space for young people to socialize and take on leadership roles with adult guidance. Research also documents the ways young people involved in GSAs identify as both victims and agents, and that these identities inform their activist work. Researchers argue that GSAs began as adult-initiated school clubs and now youth-led organizations. However, adults remain important mentors to young people in these spaces. Some researchers argue that in order for lasting change in schools, GSAs must have adult involvement that is consistent, informed on LGBTQ issues, and provides guidance to young people in the GSA. Researchers also point out that GSAs have done little in terms of social activism or policy reform. And while this may be true, this argument dismisses the important social activism embedded in taking up space in heteronormative and cisnormative spaces like schools. The presence of a GSA is also understood as a form of activism in some ways because GSAs are often the only spaces on school campuses that provide provide supportive spaces for LGBTQ students. Research into the practices of GSAs points to how, although GSAs were originally formed to increase safety and support for LGBTQ youth, some argue that GSAs in the 21st century are providing education and advocating LGBTQ needs. So, however, while challenging school sanction oppression of queer identities, GSAs have failed to address a range of intersecting societal policies. I don't want to go to this slide yet, so I'm going to go back. So they've failed to address a range of intersecting societal phobias like racism, sexism, and ageism. I think GSAs and current queer and trans youth activism can learn a lot from the history of queer youth activism, including the ways Vanguard most effectively organized when basing their activism around a multiplicity of community-based injustices. GSAs, on the other hand, focus on the single issue of gay identity as a marker of oppression and have not acknowledged intersecting inequalities of race, class, gender, and sexuality that lead queer young people to experience sexuality and oppressions in different ways. To remedy this, national GSA umbrella organizations like GLSEN have recently begun to address these injustices in the way that queer youth of color are uniquely affected by societal injustices. By integrating self-reflection regarding their shortcomings and an attention to a multiplicity of identities beyond sexuality, GSAs could produce a more varied alum of youth leaders equipped to implement a variety of organizational and activist strategies that move beyond the high school and into their respective communities. My goal here isn't to critique GSAs, but is instead to think about how this history of queer and trans youth organizing might be useful today, and to consider the ways activism within the institution differs from activism outside the institution. So in this talk, I've drawn on the example of Vanguard to think about activism on the streets, and GSAs as an example of activism within the institution. Both kinds of activism understand homophobia and transphobia to be systemic, but have different ideas about what should be done to address it. Activism within institutions often seeks to create shifts that will make the institution more safe or livable for marginalized people. And we can see this in the ways that activism within schools often fights for more bathrooms for trans youth, or more LGBTQ representation in teachers and counselors, and more policies to support gender expression. But this activism is stuck in playing by the rules of the institution, whereas activism on the street is more often fighting to dismantle the institution and to destroy the system that reproduces inequities. Youth activism within the institution is often led by adults, and adults typically have power and privilege in those institutions and aren't interested necessarily in completely dismantling the institution because they're invested in it. This difference between activism on the streets and activism within the institution also impacts what kind of activism youth engage in. Youth activism on the streets is more often multi-issue, community-driven, whereas activism is in the institution is typically single-issue activism. I think both kinds of activism are important and valuable. And that's it. I have like so many thoughts about where this could go, but I'm gonna end it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Julia. That's fantastic. Is it possible to stop sharing your screen?
Of course.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's great. And you're right. I too have got notes upon notes of intersecting issues and questions. So lots to discuss. This fantastic start. Turning things over now to Hava Gordon from University of Denver. Hava, please take us away.
Hold on, I'm just trying to share my screen here. Oh no, I'm having some difficulty sharing for some reason. Let's see.
Want to email your slides maybe to Shihan and he could share them for you? I sometimes have issues sharing too. I don't know why. Or
Okay.
Yep.
I was going to say, if you throw them over to me, Hava, I'm happy to share my screen, and you can just tell me when to move. Hava, are you sharing with Shihan or with myself? Which is just fine.
Sorry, I just sent it to Shihan.
Great. Okay.
Okay. And Shihan, just let me know if you've received it. And if not, I'm happy to just talk through the slides too.
Yeah.
I can do that as well. All right.
Do you have the slides?
I haven't received it yet, but I'm checking my.
Okay.
Okay. I can go ahead and start, no problem. So I'm Hava Gordon. I'm coming to you from University of Denver, the home of the ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho, who have historical and contemporary connections to this land we call Denver. So I wanted to echo some of the many good points that Janet and Julia have raised, actually. I'm so glad to see there are ties between these in terms of adultism and adult-driven politics and how youth get left out of those. So I first want to underscore some models, much like Julia demonstrated, of insider versus outsider, or institutional based versus social movement based forms of youth activism. And one would be school-based civic engagement programs. And so those would include service learning programs, volunteerism, civics curricula, and all of these are important for developing young people's orientations to politics. But when we're talking about adultism and maybe adult-driven kind of agendas, it's really important to recognize that some of these engagement programs have been instituted because of a presumed assumption of a crisis of youth apathy. And here I'm actually drawing on much of the work that Jessica Taft and I have done on thinking through different models of adultism in different kind of institutionalized spaces. And I'm so glad she's here attending. But these can actually include presumptions that there's a crisis of youth apathy. And so we need programs to teach young people how to be civically responsible, how to be engaged. And when we talk about engagement, often the assumption is that we're talking about the eventual voting adult. So that's a very narrow form of engagement, but sometimes that's the assumption that undergirds much of these school-based curricula. And we're also talking about how to get youth into normative politics. So how do we create good adult voters? And then there are some adult-driven models that actually are outside of schools. So those might include youth councils, for example. And in both Jessica Taft's and my own work, we actually encountered many youth activists who had experiences in their town or city youth councils and actually left those to opt for more forms of direct action kind of politics. So if you're not familiar with youth councils, those can actually be great opportunities for adults to position youth as experts in local politics. And so you would think that that might hold some more potential for young people to impact actual policy making. But when we look at some of the gatekeepers of those youth councils, we see that oftentimes the youth that participate are appointed by adults, or if they apply, they have to be selected by adults. So even the youth that end up on these councils might be filtered through often adult criterias. They're not necessarily representative of youth collectives. And oftentimes youth advise as their position as experts, but they're not allowed to vote. So youth councils don't always let youth have actual impact. They may have voice, but not actual impact. Also, it's important to think through what issues young people are invited to weigh in on as part of these councils. And oftentimes adults identify those issues as youth issues, but then youth don't get to weigh in on other issues. So things like local budgets or expenditures or parks. Almost everything you can think of is actually a youth issue. But oftentimes in these youth councils, youth issues are carefully framed and narrowed by adults. And of course, since this is managed by the state, this can result in less disruptive, critical, or oppositional youth politics. So I want to contrast those forms of adult-driven models of youth participation with social movement participation. And of course, we know that adultism also animates young people's social movement participation, but there are some key differences. I think social movement participation relies on participatory democracy rather than representative democracy. It goes beyond developing a sense of civic responsibility or civic identity, and it emphasizes collective agency to challenge inequality. Also, when we look at social movements as a route for young people's politics, it doesn't assume a crisis of youth apathy, that it's a real recognition that youth are engaged in the here and now. They are active and they can take action even if they can't vote, for example. And I would argue that it allows for a much broader array of intergenerational relationships, ranging from horizontal to hierarchical. So when we think about the social movement context and intergenerational relationships in this context, I think we have to recognize that that adult privilege actually gets youth a lot of good stuff. So I want to talk about the good stuff before I talked about the adultism. So adult privilege gives young people, most importantly, resources. So money, for example, organizational and financial resources, staff members, the infrastructure that young people need for longer lasting organizing and impact. So for example, in the US, oftentimes with nonprofit organizations, it requires boards of nonprofits to receive insurance or grants or sign contracts or legal support. That's one way that adultism can be built into to structures. And so one reason why youth might need adults for longer lasting organizational based activism. Space, so space to meet is critical for young people. And I know we have online spaces, but I would argue also that offline spaces are vital for creating activist agendas and tactics and victories. In universities or schools, also adults can be really important in accessing institutional memory or histories, perspectives on institutional arrangements. Since youth cycle in and out of these settings, adult and administrator even perspectives can be really important for shaping campaigns or agendas. Also, I've seen really powerful instances of adults connecting young people with historical or political educations, educations that often kids don't receive in their schools, but to connect them to a history of activism, which helps young people contextualize their own needs or agendas in a historical kind of perspective. Adults also have cultural capital. And, of course, this is impacted by race and class and gender. So adult cultural capital is not all the same. But I've certainly seen adults use their cultural capital as a passport into adult-dominated spaces. So being able to talk alongside youth with legislators, with principals of schools, even with parents, that can be really important. And then finally, intergenerational relationships are vital for youth activism because of the caring relationships they can foster. And especially for youth of color, Sean Ginwright's concept of radical healing for addressing traumas of systemic racism, that can be a precondition for youth organizing. So in all these ways, adult resources are vital for youth organizing. And this is where it gets tricky because it becomes a mixed bag, because it often comes with adultism. And so a couple ways that can show up is the institutionalization of youth activism in funded nonprofits or NGOs. So for example, these NGOs can be potent sites for impactful and activating educations. They can seed lifelong commitments to activism, but they also entail a structural dependence on adults for funding, for campaign priorities, etc. And so this can actually, I'd like to echo some of Julia's points. This can actually moderate young people's activism. It can kind of mute some of their aims, and it can lead activism towards more insider tactics rather than outsider tactics. But there's also interactional adultism that takes place when young people and adults share the same social movement spaces. And this can include patronizing, this can include tokenizing, viewing youth through a developmental lens, so looking at them as practice for the real thing instead of potentially making a change in the present. Certainly adultism manifests as adults taking up space in social movement organizations, taking up voice in organizations, or even just applauding youth in a patronizing way because we expect apathy. So those are all ways that adultism can play out both institutionally and interpersonally. I would also argue that the way young people try to get around adultism, both inside social movement spaces and outside, can also be shaped by power and privilege related to other axes of inequality. So I've seen, for example, young white middle-class teenagers who have tried to keep a youth-only space talk about the ways they switch, kind of code switch between how young people talk and how adults talk. And they talked about this access to linguistic capital that's really based in some class and race privilege, I would say. Also spatial capital. So when youth can organize maybe without adults' presence, sometimes that means they can access safe spaces, autonomous spaces, where they'll be free from police harassment, where they'll be free from neighborhood violence. So that might also involve some kind of privilege that some youth already have. Also, the ways that young people use academic achievement or not as political leverage can actually be rooted in race and class inequality. So in my work, I've studied how, for example, white middle-class youth in Portland, Oregon organized and were sometimes taken seriously by adults in their lives without their grades or their academic achievement being part of that legitimacy. Whereas Black and Latine youth in Oakland, for example, really had to keep up their grades in order to be taken seriously as activists and social actors. Also looking at the ways that youth have autonomy or not, or mobility or not in terms of their families. And this can often be a gender issue. So in my research, boys had a lot more autonomy from their parents, could coalesce with other activists in their communities in ways that were different from girls. So there's a lot of ways that that young people's abilities to skirt around adult power and adultism can actually be shaped by their positions in racial and class and gender hierarchies. But intersectionality and movement innovation, it's not just about disadvantage. And of course, intersectionality can actually drive movement innovation for not just youth, but larger movements. So for example, the coming out stories and movements for undocumented students can fuse queer organizing and immigrants' rights together. Young water protectors fuse Indigenous histories and their own futures and the future of the planet in their fights for Native sovereignty and the challenge of the ongoing project of settler colonialism. So many other ways that young activists are leveraging their intersectional identities to redefine labor movements, climate justice, and immigration justice on a global scale. So I'm trying to think of ways that we can maximize the use of adult resources for youth activists and minimize adultism. And one way would be to explicitly recognize ageism as an axis of inequality. And the youth activist organizations I've seen that really give youth actual power to not just speak, but also have impact are the organizations where adults have to step back and reflect on their own adultism, and where youth feel empowered to call adults on their adultism. And this goes beyond just interacting with each other and kind of a cultural shift in organizations, but using that recognition to build formal structures that limit adult power. So being very clear on when adults can vote or when youth can vote, and having that built into structures. Also recognizing that youth political development is horizontal. So we don't just have to socialize young people to be civically engaged, that actually youth activists socialize each other, and youth innovate movements and develop adults and adult politics too. So that's where I'm most excited about looking at the ways that adult or youth organizing actually changes adult strategies and tactics too. And I would also say it's important for us to investigate why youth activism might fall short. And I think for allies of youth activists and for scholars studying youth activism, we tend to be very celebratory without being critical. And so I would say we need to move beyond viewing youth activists as exceptional and amazing, and should take young people's organizing as seriously as we would take adults' activism. So we should ask, why do youth activists sometimes fall short of producing social change? What are the invisible institutional or cultural constraints on their agency? What are the barriers to their activism? And what do these reveal about the possibilities for a fully realized youth political subjectivity? So this doesn't mean criticizing youth activists themselves. It means trying to understand why their movements succeed or fail, so we can understand the future of our politics more generally. And then the last thing I'll say is it's important to shift the focus to coalition building. And I think this is also where Julia's points about multi-issue versus single issue come into play. So are there points of interest convergence between activist kids and adults that better predict age-diverse coalitions? Are there key social issues in which young people hold certain legitimacy or centrality that adults don't? And if so, how might these actually help the formation of age-diverse coalitions? How strong are these coalitions, given the prevalence of adultism in our society? And then finally, how does adultism play a role in movement demobilization? So what might be models for counteracting adultist methods of organizing, so that age-diverse coalitions can survive and thrive? And to me, these questions are critical because that helps us to understand the ways that young people can weave the social and political fabric that we all share. So I'll end there. Thank you.
That's awesome, Hava. Thank you so much. And Jihan, thank you so much for your working through the PowerPoint. That was seamless, and things worked out. Yeah, let's all as a panel, I think, as a session, give thanks to our panelists who have presented a range of historical and contemporary research that touch on a number of different elements of the life world of activists. There are a number of overlapping themes, it seems to me, that allow us to bring together these presentations. Just a reminder to folks who came in a little later, our format is I'm going to lead with some questions for our panelists to try to bring our presentations into a dialogue. And then there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A from our audience in about, 10 minutes time, let's say. So if you have questions, please either share them in the chat or take advantage of the hand raise function in the Zoom, and I'll look for your hand in a few minutes to bring you into the conversation. One reminder, if you could keep your questions succinct so we have a chance for as many exchanges as possible. And we have about a little over 20 minutes for this section. So again, to Janet and Julia and Hava, thank you so much for your presentations. Really fantastic geography, historically and spatially, of youth activists and their work. One of the ideas that immediately comes to mind in the work that you've shared this afternoon for Janet, is this sense of how belonging and a space of orientation to a politics of youth activism operates in the institutional and non-institutional sites that you've shared with us. And I wonder if you could perhaps begin by elaborating a little bit on how a sense of belonging begins to ignite or open up a question that Janet really began with, which is this sense of how the political is identified and understood by the youth activists that you're working with, that you're thinking about. And when I say belonging, I really do think of it, and I wonder if this is helpful, in a sense of orientation, of a sense of beginning to launch a place of connection, of collaboration, but also a space that allows youth activists to see themselves beginning to shape the world around them. And I wonder if that's a theme you might pick up on and talk a little bit about how that is part of your work, or what you're seeing around the sites of that you've discussed with us, how they shape this politics of belonging for young people. Is that something folks could pick up on? Julie, I see Janet's leaning back, so I'm tempted to not. Janet, would you mind starting with that?
I can say something, I think. Maybe I wonder if the sort of coming together around a rejection of something within the system is a starting point for some of this. And then the kind of creation of attachment within those spaces that have been created that are very explicitly not of the normative. Yeah, that's one of the things I think we've seen in various spaces that we've been alongside in our work. Yeah, so it's absolutely not an essentialist sense of belonging. It comes out of a refusal. That's the starting point, anyhow.
I really appreciate that, Janet. It makes me think of an organization in Toronto called Sketch, which has worked with homeless youth for many years, and the sense of rejection and a space of refusal as a point of beginning for creative work that begins to mobilize a politics has seemed to be part of their operation for years. I think of Hava and Julia's work as also introducing us to a complicated way in which rejection and Hava, what you talked about as some of the useful elements of adultism, create kind of complicated dynamics in the way rejection and coordination, collaboration work together as beginnings for a politics of youth activism. Something you might pick up on?
I would like to pick up on that and actually echo something that Janet said, I think, which is that youth might feel alienated from politics, but they feel connected to activism. That distinction is so important. I think that's what you said, Janet, if I'm not mistaken. And I absolutely have seen that, in terms of real exclusion and then a kind of rejection of politics versus an embracing of activism. But that's true, that begins to be really difficult when adult resources and adultism come together sometimes in the same package. What I've seen is that young people who have tried to cut adults out of their organizing entirely they struggle with building the belonging with each other because they only have a certain window of time to be a young person in this organization before they lose legitimacy, because there's not really a path of continuity from youth to adulthood that they can survive in that organization. So I feel like there's something unstable about that model where youth might, like some of the internal tensions might destabilize and young people only have so much time. Whereas I've seen in other models where adults can reflect on their adultism and catch themselves, or youth can call them out and continually work on that to make relationships better, then young people can kind of age into that organization and stay in that organization and then become leaders. And there's some kind of a belonging to organizational history, to the perspective of the organization, to strategies and tactics and campaigns. So belonging is almost easier when that can happen intergenerationally. Sorry.
That's great, Hava. Thank you. Julia, may we?
Yeah, I mean, connecting to what what both Janet and Hava have said, I'm thinking about how, a lot of folks in Vanguard first joined Vanguard because they were either living on the street or rejected from their family because of their queer identity. And so I think in a similar kind of way that maybe some youth kind of create belonging today is out of that piece around rejection. And I'm thinking about GSAs and if they are a bit different and how, and I think there's something, there's more like curiosity or exploring or discovery that I think some folks come to GSAs with than maybe coming to Vanguard. But I think Vanguard, like that group is really similar to the like kind of youth organization in New York, STAR, that folks might be familiar with, which is also based around building kind of queer family outside of traditional family bonds. So I'm also thinking about the ways that youth organizing is a sense different form of family for folks and how belonging relates to them.
Nice.
That's great, Julia. May I pick up on some of these? I have a couple of questions, but I'm conscious of time. So I'm going to ask one question, if I may, before turning over to our audience. And it's a theme that is present in all three of your talks, including what you've just shared with us, Julia. And it's one that in the shadows of COVID have become a significant part of youth spaces. And it's this question of the significance of institutional or physical spaces of gathering that I think Janet pointed to early on, particularly with reference to, I want to go back and the role of sharing, the role of listening, the role of the physical body in the practice of listening. And I wonder if I could ask the three of you to reflect on what significance physical space has in a time when online is so regularly put before us as a efficient, cost-effective, vernacular even form of connective tissue in young people's lives. And I want to say that I feel as though we're at a point where we need a re-articulation of the real significance of physical space as a glue in youth activism. And I wonder what the three of you think about that, if you could reflect on that. Anybody want to jump in first?
I can go first. I mean, I am an activist and I live with activists. So also there's like that piece where there's been like such a loss in terms of the gathering in my house. And it's only been in the last few months that like folks have come over and like we've shared food and like talked about ideas together in kind of activist space. And then the other piece that I'll share is that a lot of the work I'm doing at Carleton around activism, like with students, is creating a calls to action to address the needs of the trans community at Carleton. And I've also noticed the lack of ability to gather in person around that has really impacted the ways we all feel connected and the kind of coherence of the group and the ability to kind of challenge the institution on these issues. So those are my initial thoughts, but I'm really curious to hear what other folks say. Oh, and I'm thinking about QP, 4600 today and seeing photos of folks gathering on the picket line and how, oh God, it's like so exciting. They're, yeah, that's all.
There's a parallel labor movement happening at SFU, and Julia, the presence of the picket line as a physical reality that people then have to negotiate, and through feet, through talk, through physical positioning, these are all ways in which the reality of labor strife actually comes to be experienced rather than just thought or represented, that can feel, as tile world can, distant and formal. Hava, Janet, any thoughts, please?
So many. So many.
Janet, do you want to go?
One thing that I'd say about the city I'm in, that the places and neighbourhoods of gathering matter hugely because of the divided nature of the city, and because of the sense that some parts of the city are sacrifice zones. Then gathering in those spaces and in those areas makes an enormous difference, actually. And it's hard to, thank you for the question, because it's made me think about that and think, with Party Space, we knew we had to be in those parts of the city in order to understand things that we couldn't understand without being in those parts of the city. And some, for many of us, we have our own connections and our own lives in those places too. So these, as you've just said, Julia, they're not separate from our scholarship, are they? Yeah, at the same time, I do know people who, particularly in the trans community, who would say that this online space is life-saving. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Hope for both. I hope for both. Really.
Hava?
Well, I mean, Jennifer Earle, movement scholar, says that young people's organizing is the closest thing we'll have to a crystal ball in terms of seeing where protest goes next. And she talks a lot about young people's use of online spaces, to create new identities, new cultural shifts in society. But then I'm also thinking of Janet's quote of Audre Lorde, I think, about difference and intersectional identities, and how intersectionality is so embodied. It's rooted in the body. It's the lived experience that we go through every day. And so maybe there's a connection there also between being in a physical space, a holistic view of young people as multiple, inhabiting multiple identities. Even mental health, is becoming much more politicized and folded into youth organizing. So for that reason, I also think it can't be all online. There has to be some kind of embodied physical to it.
Yeah, just building on what Hava said, I feel like I have no idea what's going on TikTok, but I know there's a lot of really awesome trans organizing going on TikTok. And I don't even know where to start with it.
Yeah, I mean, I listen,
but I think that's possible in some ways because of COVID. I think COVID has, in some ways, created TikTok as a space where that activism happens.
Absolutely, Julian. I would say that it's normalized Zoom in a way that allows us to have collective gatherings over short time, even with all its limits, in ways that pre-2020, I think we would all have seen as too compromised as a communication platform. So that's been an interesting shift in our way of legitimizing this space. I'm conscious of our time, and so I want to open up opportunity for our audience to share questions, and if they could, as I mentioned earlier, remain succinct, that would be very helpful. So I'll open the floor now, and If anybody would like to raise their hand, please use the hand raise function, or if you have a question in the chat, I'll keep an eye on the chat to see what comes up there, as will Shihan. And please. Jackie's like right on, so I'm going to turn to Jackie right now. I know she's. Go ahead, Jackie, please.
I tried to hold, I was like, I'll just wait, see if anyone else puts their hand up. But of course I have lots of questions. But if anyone else has something they'd like to step in, because I have the privilege of being able, of knowing all these folks. And but I will, okay, so such great presentations. Thank you, everyone. And I agree with everything everybody said, and like lots of really excellent, thought-provoking ideas, and question I am preoccupied with, folks who know my work, I've done work with young activists, and then the last decade or so, I've been working with homeless young people, also around their political engagement. And so this has coalesced into a project and a book that are forthcoming, and that in that, I was really trying to explore the ways in which inequality and wealth inequality, and therefore a lot about social class, impact young people's abilities to engage with the political world. And I'm curious, I mean, we're talking, and of course, class intersects in complicated ways with many other identities. But because of the sort of two groups I was looking at, it really was apparent the degree to which access to post-secondary education in particular allowed young people to move into activism, even if they hadn't come from social origins that encouraged activism. And as Hava has said, and I maybe Julia and Janet also mentioned this, like schools are not setting young people up to be activists, right? Yeah, no, Julia, you definitely talked about that, the GSA. And so young people have to be getting it from somewhere else. And they're often, because it's not available in the public sphere in schooling, they're getting it from their families, or they're getting it through, maybe through friends or through post-secondary. And then these homeless young people almost universally are not accessing post-secondary and do not have, the other ways in which to be politicized in the way that I think we're talking about here. That is, and actually some of them don't even understand the formal systems because they haven't even received that basic civics education, because if they dropped out of school at grade 6 or grade 8. So I'm bringing my preoccupations. This is not succinct at all, Stuart. I'm not at all following your instructions. Talk to me about social class. Janet, you talked about the working class youth and their identity. I'm super interested in that. And the UK has a different context than Canada in the US, and around like a much more explicit conversation about class culturally and socially than we have here. So
I think that's why I'm so interested in these spaces that I can call social spaces, precisely because, and I think really important in all this, are first generation people who've been at university, but their families have not. Mm-hmm. And then they return to the place that they're from to be with and be alongside, often in community organising of various kinds. And that's where some of the practices that I was speaking about come into their own, because they're not practices that require the status that's given by higher education or post-secondary education. And also they kind of can swerve away from the hierarchies that are required. This is what Hava was speaking about, the hierarchies. You were calling it adultism. I guess I think of it as institutional powers of various kinds, really, that include adult power, but are not restricted to it or by it. So Bourdieu is my guide to all of that, I guess, really.
Oh, yeah. You definitely use Bourdieu. Yeah. But Janet, when you speak of, so it sounds like you're talking about working class youth who are first generation, who've been able to kind of transcend the barriers and attend post-secondary. and that is that a bit of an essential interim step before they seem to be able to go back to community and do the organizing? That's because there's, for so many young people, and increasingly as inequality grows, they don't even have access to that. And so that concerns me politically, right? In terms of then who gets access to these resources. It should not be limited to post-secondary, but I think at the moment that is a major politicizing institution. It's also a depoliticizing institution. I mean, I'm not romanticizing the university by any stretch, but yeah, where do the young people get access to the political education they need to become activists if they're not getting it from public school and they're not getting it from family or an immediate community? I mean, it's been so much of this, like we were talking about the groups from the 60s, Julia. I'm really curious about where those young people came from in terms of class background. It might be much more diverse because in the 60s there was, I think, a lot more public education around activism and opportunities to become involved, but so much of that has been shut down through neoliberalism.
I mean, part of the story that I've read about in regards to Vanguard is that it started off right in the Tenderloin. And as they gained momentum in some ways, and as folks maybe aged or like whatever, a large part of the leadership moved to the Haight. If you know San Francisco, they moved to kind of the more like hippie area, closer to Golden Gate Park. And in that shift, they fell apart a bit, right? Because they lost a lot of the folks who were coming from like lower class backgrounds, who couldn't move to the Haight. And so that was part of their demise, was not being able to hold on to folks from different class backgrounds or in different class experiences at that time.
And I would just say, given our talk about digital, online versus offline activism, maybe the pandemic era actually underscored some of the digital divide we still live with. And we often think online spaces are more democratizing and more accessible to all kinds of youth. But when we look at the challenges with remote learning during the pandemic, we see that there are huge, disparities there. That's not just about learning, that's also about accessing political voice and impact, right?
We are at 9:30, friends, and or at half past the hour, so we're at our border, and so I think we need to pull ourselves to a conclusion on what is obviously a talk that could go on for some time. Were we all in the same space together, we'd now be ordering either coffee for me because it's morning, or others for and continuing this conversation. I want to thank Janet and Julia and Hava for very compelling presentations. And I think Hava and Julia will understand when I say, Janet, really in the midst of the pain you shared with us at the beginning, a remarkable presentation to get us going. So thank you very much for that. To Shihan and Jackie for pulling us together. Harriet's message, I think, is I wish we could continue. And I don't know how you guys have handled this before, but I know there's capacity to continue. I unfortunately have to jump out myself. My day is now beginning, and there's people outside this room awaiting me. So Jackie and Shihana, you might want to continue this even if I have to jump out and
oh, Harriet
oh,
can't.
no. Well done. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Listen, I do want to offer this moment as an opportunity for folks to share in the chat relevant work that they might want to draw attention to as part of our conversation, because this is something that's useful for us to know and fertilize each other's work through this process. So please do right now.
And including your own, because we've got lots of wonderful scholars in our group too who are engaging in exactly these ideas.
So I'm gonna jump in and I'm gonna share a new book on it's called Youth Sites, and it's on youth arts communities in cities around the world, and it really captures a number of the themes about the precarity of institutional space, the way in which the evacuation of the political, as Janet shared with us, has been part of how organizations have consolidated but also negotiated space for themselves. And please, to others, share that work, because this is a group of people who can then amplify and move it around. Maybe we'll just give a moment to allow that to happen before our chat closes down. But thank you. What an awesomely interesting panel. And my notebook is filled with some fantastic ideas and references. And so thank you all. And you can see the gratitude in the chat coming through. I think all we can say is we'd like more, please.
Like more. Yeah, and thank you, Stuart. Make sure we also appreciate your gentle and precise moderation. It's a fantastic guide through the morning. So also much appreciation to you, and for starting your morning really quite early to join us.
It's got my week all ready to go. So thank you all. Take care where you are, be safe, and all the best in continuing this extremely important work. Jackie, Shihan, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And there's a recording, and so please feel free to share that once it's up with colleagues, or refer back to it. So this conversation can have some longevity.